Chapter 7 of Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, C.S.A., and Second Bishop of Tennessee, by Charles Todd Quintard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Personal Narrative, Shelbyville. Having placed Willie Huger in comfortable quarters in Chattanooga, and watched over him as long as I was able to, I returned to the army. At Shelbyville I found General Polk's headquarters, occupying the grounds of William Gosling, Esquire. The Gosling family were old friends of mine, and insisted upon my making their house my home. General Polk had his office in the house. Mrs. Gosling was an ideal housekeeper, and made me feel in every respect at home. We remained nearly 6 months in Shelbyville, most of the army being camped about Tullahoma. Soon after the Battle of Murfreesboro, General Bragg was removed from the command of the Army of the Tennessee, and General Johnston was sent to Shelbyville. On the 7th of February, 1863, we had a grand review by General Johnston, who rode my horse, to me the most interesting item of the review; for I had seen so much of marching and countermarching that I was tired of it all. Thoroughly disgusted, indeed. It was a brilliant pageant, nevertheless. The troops looked and marched well, and General Johnston expressed the greatest satisfaction with what he witnessed. He said he had never seen men he would rather trust. I found General Johnston a charming man. I was constantly with him at General Polk's headquarters, and enjoyed his visit to the army very much. He was of perfectly simple manners, of easy and graceful carriage, and a good conversationalist. He had used his utmost endeavor to keep General Bragg in command of the Army of the Tennessee, though when he was ordered in May to take command of the forces of Mississippi, General Bragg remarked to me, "Doctor, he was kept here too long to watch me." Afterwards, in command of the Army of the Tennessee, no man enjoyed a greater popularity than he did. Soldiers and citizens alike recognized that General Johnston possessed a solid judgment, invincible firmness, imperturbable self-reliance, and a perseverance which no difficulties could subdue. It was my privilege to be frequently with the General after the war, and more he entered into the religious life, illustrating in his daily walk and conversation the highest type of the Christian gentleman. He was one of the pallbearers at the funeral of General Sherman at a time when his health was far from strong. He caught cold and died of heart failure in March, 1891. The weather was at times very inclement while we were in Shelbyville, and I suffered much illness. I kept at my work as well as I could, however, and often I preached before distinguished congregations, as, for example, when Generals Johnston, Polk, Cheatham, and nearly all the general officers and staffs were present. The congregations were usually large. I recall reading with a great deal of zest one day, when the weather was very inclement and I was by illness kept in the house, a publication entitled Robinson Crusoe. Perhaps my readers may have heard of such a book. And one night in February, General Polk and I remained up until 2 o'clock, and the Bishop General gave me a detailed account of the manner in which his mind was turned to serious things while he was at West Point, practically the same story that may be found in Dr. William M. Polk's recently published life of his father. On another occasion the General and I were riding out together, and he mentioned the following odd incident to me. His eldest son, when at college in the North, purchased a gold-headed walking stick as a present to the Bishop. Wishing his name and seal engraved upon it, the son took it to an engraver in New York, giving him a picture of the Bishop's seal as published in a church almanac. The seal was a simple shield, having for its device a cross in the center, with a crozier and key laid across it. By some hocus pocus, the artist engraved a crozier and a sword instead of the key. The Bishop had the cane still when he told me this, and I think it was his intention to adopt that device as his seal thenceforth. But of course, as we all know, the Bishop's death before the close of the war prevented his adopting a seal for his future work in the episcopate. It must not be supposed, however, that my time was idly spent in Shelbyville, or in reading such books as Robinson Crusoe, and listening to the charming conversation of General Polk and others. On the 2nd of March, at the request of my fellow chaplains, General Bragg issued an order to the effect that I was assigned to duty at the general hospitals of Polk's corps, and was to proceed to a central point and there establish my office. With the approval of medical officers, I was to visit the different hospitals, rendering such services and affording such relief and consolation to the sick and wounded as a minister only could give. On my copy of this order was endorsed, "Transportation furnished in kind from Wartrace to Atlanta, March 3, '63." So I went off and was gone several weeks, visiting my family in Rome, Georgia, before my return. I made also a trip to Columbia, Tennessee, on business relating to my new appointment, a distance of 40 miles from Shelbyville, over roads none the best at the time. While I was in Rome, I received a very characteristic letter from my friend Colonel Yeatman, on Polk's staff, which gave me an amusing account of the services held in Shelbyville on the day appointed by the President of the Confederate States to be observed as a day of fasting and prayer. The chaplain of an Alabama regiment preached a very good sermon, the letter says, and then your brother wound up with a prayer, eminently a war prayer, in which he prayed that there the Yankees' moral sensibilities might be awakened by the roar of our cannon and the gleam of our bayonets, and that the stars and bars might soon wave in triumph through these beleaguered states. And then, after prescribing a course which he desired might be followed by the Lord, he quit. It is such a good example of the manner in which some persons attempt to preach to the people while they pray to God, that it is quite worth quoting here. The visit of Bishop Elliott of Georgia to Shelbyville was a great event. He arrived on the 23rd of May and was most affectionately welcomed by his friend General Polk, and remained with us at Mr. Gosling's house 2 weeks. Services were held every day and the Bishop preached. Everywhere he was received most enthusiastically. The Presbyterian Church in Shelbyville was by far the largest church building in the town, and as it was without a pastor at the time, I had been invited to occupy it and had accepted the very kind invitation. We accordingly held services there on Sunday, the 24th of May. In the morning I said the service, and the Bishop celebrated the Holy Communion and preached. In the afternoon the Bishop preached one of his most eloquent sermons, and I presented a class of 10 persons for confirmation. It included Colonel Yeatman, Colonel Porter of the 6th Tennessee, Major Hoxton, Chief of Artillery on Hardee's staff, Lieutenant Smith on General Chatham's staff, Surgeon Green, 4th Tennessee, 4 privates of my own regiment, 1 private of the 51st Alabama Cavalry, and a lady. It was a very novel sight to see a large church crowded in every part with officers and soldiers. Scarcely a dozen of the gentler sex were to be seen. The attention of this large body of soldiers was earnest, and like that of men who were thoughtful about their souls. Being anxious for the Bishop to officiate for my regiment, I made an appointment with him for the following day to preach to the brigade under General George Maney at their camp. The service was held at the headquarters of Colonel Porter of the 6th Regiment. The attendance was very large, and the Bishop said he had never had a more orderly or attentive congregation in a church. I conducted the service and the Bishop preached. On Tuesday I was very unwell, but felt it my duty to drive 6 miles to the front and visit with the Bishop the brigade of General Manigault of South Carolina. He was on outpost duty and was only a few miles from the pickets of General Rosecrans' army. The service was at 5 o'clock. The whole brigade was in attendance, having been marched to the grove arranged for the service, under arms. I assisted in the service and undertook to baptize a captain of the 28th Alabama, but was taken ill, and being unable to proceed, the Bishop took my place. It was a very solemn service indeed. The captain knelt in the presence of his brother soldiers and enlisted under the banner of Christ crucified. After which the Bishop preached to the assembled officers and soldiers seated on the ground in concentric circles. It was an admirable extempore discourse, which fell with great effect upon the hearts of all who heard it. On returning to Shelbyville, I betook myself to bed, and using proper remedies, I had a comfortable night. The following day I fasted and lounged about headquarters. Mr. Vallandigham, who had been sent to us by the Federal authorities because of what were regarded as disloyal utterances made in political speeches in Ohio, dined with us, and my great desire to see him gave me strength to endure a long sitting at table, though I ate nothing. Mr. Vallandigham was altogether a different man from what I had expected. He was about my own age and height, had remarkably fine features, a frank, open countenance, beautiful teeth, and a color indicating very high health. He wore no side whiskers nor mustache, but a beard slightly tinged with gray on his chin. In manner he was extremely easy and polite, in conversation very fluent and entertaining. He was greatly pleased with the kind reception he had met from the officers of the army and the citizens of Shelbyville, but was very desirous of avoiding all public demonstration. On Thursday evening, feeling much better, I accompanied Bishop Elliott to Wartrace, the headquarters of General Hardee. General Polk and Colonel Richmond accompanied us. Later, Colonel Yeatman brought Mr. Vallandigham over in General Polk's ambulance, and we had a goodly company. At 11 o'clock we held a service in the Presbyterian Church, the use of which was kindly tendered me. There was a large congregation, consisting of officers, soldiers, and ladies. The Bishop read part of the morning service, and I preached an extempore sermon. I had not expected to say anything, but the Bishop having declined to preach, I was determined not to disappoint the congregation altogether; and I had great reason to be thankful that I did preach, for it gave me the opportunity to have a long and very delightful conversation with General Hardee about confirmation. In the afternoon, services were to have been held for the brigades of General Wood and General Lucius Polk, but rain coming on, and the services having been arranged for the open air, it was thought best to postpone them to a future occasion. The train that evening brought a very agreeable addition to our party in the person of Lieutenant Colonel Freemantle of the Coldstream Guard of the British Army. The Guard was the oldest regiment in the British service. Colonel Freemantle was only about 28, and was on furlough, just taking a hasty tour through the Confederacy to look at our army and become acquainted with our officers. He was very intelligent and very companionable. His grandfather and his father were adjutants of the Coldstream Guard, and he had held the same office. His family was an ancient and honorable one, and he seemed worthy to wear his ancestral honors. He accompanied General Polk and myself to Shelbyville the next day, and was for a while the General's guest. He had left England 3 months before, and had come into the Confederacy by way of Texas. The following Sunday I held services again in the Presbyterian Church at Shelbyville, preached to a crowded congregation, and presented another class to the Bishop for confirmation. In the afternoon we drove to Wartrace, where I said evening prayer at the headquarters of General Wood, and the Bishop preached to an immense concourse. Between 4,000 and 5,000 persons were present, and the services were most impressive and solemn. On Monday morning, June 1st, we attended a review of General Liddell's brigade. After the review, General Hardee had the brigade formed in a hollow square, and the Bishop addressed it briefly upon the religious aspects of the struggle in which we were engaged. A memorable incident of Bishop Elliott's visit to our army was General Bragg's baptism and confirmation. As soon as I found that the Bishop was able to give us a visit, I made very earnest appeals to the officers and soldiers of our army to confess Christ before men. But there was one man in the army whom I felt I could never get at. He was the Commander-in-Chief, General Braxton Bragg. He had the reputation of being so stern and so sharp in his sarcasm that many men were afraid to go near him. Yet I had often thought of him in connection with my work. He never came to the Holy Communion, and I never heard of his being a member of any religious denomination. Immediately after I received notice of Bishop Elliott's proposed visit, I determined to have a talk with General Bragg. It was late one afternoon when I started for his headquarters. I found 2 tents and a sentry at the outer one, and when I asked for General Bragg, the sentry said, "You cannot see him. He is very busy, and has given positive orders not to be disturbed, except for a matter of life and death." That cooled my enthusiasm, and I returned to my own quarters, but all the night long I blamed myself for my timidity. The next day I started out again, found the same sentry, and received the same reply. This time, however, I was resolved to see the general, no matter what happened, so I said, "It is a matter of life and death." The sentry withdrew, and in a few minutes returned and said, "You can see the general, but I advise you to be brief. He is not in a good humor." This chilled me, but I went in. I found the general dictating to two secretaries. He met me with, "Well, Dr. Quintard, what can I do for you? I'm quite busy, as you see." I stammered out that I wanted to see him alone. He replied that it was impossible, but I persisted. Finally he dismissed the secretaries, saying to me rather sternly, "Your business must be of grave importance, sir." I was very much frightened, but I asked the general to be seated, and then, fixing my eyes upon a knothole in the pine-board floor of the tent, talked about our blessed Lord and about the responsibilities of a man in the general's position. When I looked up after a while, I saw tears in the general's eyes, and took courage to ask him to be confirmed. At last he came to me, took both my hands in his, and said, "I have been waiting for 20 years to have someone say this to me, and I thank you from my heart. Certainly I shall be confirmed if you will give me the necessary instruction." I had frequent interviews with him subsequently on this subject, and he was baptized and confirmed. The latter service took place in Shelbyville on the afternoon of our return from Wartrace. Wishing to make the usual record, I asked the general to give me the names of his parents and the date of his birth. In reply he sent me the following note: "My dear Doctor, I was born in the town of Warrenton, Warren County, North Carolina, on the 21st of June, 1817, son of Thomas Bragg and Margaret Crossland, his wife. Though too late in seeking, but not, I hope, in obtaining the pardon offered to all who penitently confess, I trust time will yet be allowed me to prove the sincerity with which I have at last undertaken the task. For the kindness and consideration of yourself and the good and venerable Bishop, for whom my admiration has ever been very great, I shall never cease to be grateful. My mind has never been so much at ease, and I feel renewed strength for the task before me. Faithfully yours, Braxton Bragg. Toward the end of our stay in Shelbyville, it was my privilege to assist in getting two ladies through the enemy's lines. The Reverend Mr. Clark, rector of St. Paul's Church, Augusta, Georgia, had been appointed by the Bishop of Georgia a missionary to the army, that is, a sort of chaplain under diocesan control, and for whose support the Confederate government was in no way responsible. The plan was intended to continue the work which the Bishop had begun by his visit to our army. Mr. Clark desired to send his mother and sister to Nashville, and communicating with me in advance, I made all necessary arrangements for their transit through the lines before they arrived in our camp at Shelbyville. I obtained a pass from General Bragg and his permission for Mr. Edmund Cooper of Shelbyville to write such letters to Federal officers as he saw fit. Mr. Cooper was in a position to be of great service to us, for although a Union man and afterwards private secretary to President Johnson and Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury, his brothers were in the Confederate Army. He accordingly gave us letters to General Rosecrans and Governor Andrew Johnson. General Wheeler wrote to Colonel Webb, in command of our outpost, requesting him to do all in his power for the welfare of the party. In the morning, the two ladies, accompanied by the Reverend Mr. Clark, my old classmate Dr. Frank Stanford, then General Wheeler's medical director, and myself, left Shelbyville in a fine 4-horse ambulance. On our way to the front, 9 miles out, we reached General Martin's headquarters, where our passports were examined and approved. 3 miles further on we reached Colonel Webb, who gave us a note to Lieutenant Spence of the outer picket, still 3 miles further in advance. Lieutenant Spence conducted us to a house where we were kindly received and made to feel quite at home. He sent one of his scouts forward to the residence of Colonel Lytle, 2 miles further on in the neutral ground, to inform him of our arrival and to take letters to him from Mr. Cooper and myself, asking his assistance in conveying the ladies through the enemy's lines. About 2 o'clock, Colonel and Mrs. Lytle arrived in their carriage. The latter kindly offered to accompany the ladies through the Federal lines to the house of a friend, where they could remain until they could communicate with General Rosecrans. At this point we made our adieus, and on returning to camp stopped for dinner at Colonel, afterward General, Strahl's headquarters. The day was a pleasant one, and the whole party was greatly pleased with the trip. The Rev. Mr. Clark remained with me over the following Sunday, and held services for one of our regiments. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, C.S.A., and 2nd Bishop of Tennessee, by Charles Todd Quintard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Personal Narrative, A Dramatic Episode. A short time before we left Shelbyville, I was a participant in one of the most solemn and at the same time one of the most dramatic scenes of my whole life. I was requested one day by General Polk to visit two men who were sentenced to be shot within a few days for desertion. One of them belonged to the 19th Tennessee Regiment and the other to the 8th Tennessee. The former was a man of 47 years of age, the latter not more than 23. I cannot describe the feelings which oppressed me on my first visit in compliance with the General's request. I urged upon both men, with all the powers of my persuasion, an attention to the interests of their souls. The younger man was, I believe, really in earnest in endeavoring to prepare for death, but the other seemed to have no realizing sense of his condition. I found that the younger man had a Cumberland Presbyterian minister for a chaplain, for whom I sent, and who would minister to him. I called upon Governor Harris and begged him to see the judges of the court and find if there was any possibility of having the men pardoned. I never begged so hard for anything in my life as for the lives of these men. I had a special sympathy for the older man, for he had deserted to visit his wife and children. However, the day came for their execution. The Cumberland Presbyterian chaplain baptized the man belonging to his regiment. I remained in town the night preceding the day appointed for the execution, and from 8 o'clock to 9 the Cumberland Presbyterian chaplain and myself engaged in prayer privately on behalf of the condemned men. At 7 in the morning I gave them the most comfortable sacrament of Christ's body and blood. Both prisoners seemed deeply and profoundly penitent, and to be very much in earnest in preparing for death. The room in which they were confined was a very mean and uncleanly one. Half the window was boarded up, and the light struggled through the dirt that begrimed the other half. But the sacrament itself, and the thought that the prisoners would soon be in eternity, made it all very solemn. The prisoners made an effort to give themselves up to God, and seemed to feel that this was the occasion for bidding farewell to earth and earthly things. I pronounced the benediction, placing my hand upon the head of each, and commending them to the mercy of God. At 8 o'clock the older man, to whom I was to minister in his last moments, was taken from his cell, ironed hand and feet. He was placed in an ambulance, surrounded by a guard, and we started for the brigade of Colonel Strahl, 7 miles out of town. On reaching Strahl's headquarters, the prisoner was placed in a room and closely guarded until the hour fixed for his execution, 1 o'clock, should arrive. A squad of 24 men was marched into the yard, and stacking arms, was marched off in order that the guns might be loaded by an officer, one half with blank cartridges. Leaving headquarters, preceded by a wagon bearing the prisoner's coffin, and followed by the squad which was to do the execution, we arrived on the ground precisely at 1 o'clock. The brigade was drawn up on 3 sides of a square. Colonel Strahl and his staff, Captain Stanford, Major Jack, General Polk's adjutant, and Captain Spence of General Polk's staff rode forward with me. A grave had been dug, the coffin was placed beside the grave, the prisoner was seated on it, and I took my place by his side. Captain Johnston, Colonel Strahl's adjutant, advanced and read the sentence of the court and the approval of the general. The prisoner was then informed that if he wished to make any remarks he had now an opportunity. He requested me to cut off a lock of his hair and preserve it for his wife. He then stood up and said, "I am about to die. I hope I am going to a better world. I trust that one and all of my companions will take warning by my fate." He seated himself on his coffin again, and I began the psalm, "Out of the deep have I called unto thee, O Lord," and after that the comfortable words. We then knelt down together, and I said the confession from the Communion Office. Then I turned to the office for the visitation of prisoners, and used the prayer beginning, "O Father of mercies and God of all comfort," and so on down to the benediction, "Unto God's gracious mercy and protection I commit you." I then shook hands with him and said, "Be a man, it will soon be over." The firing squad was in position, the guns were cocked, the order had been given to take aim, when Major Jack rode forward and read Special Order No. 132, the purport of which was that since the sentence of the court-martial and order for the execution of the prisoner, facts and circumstances with regard to the history and character of the man had come to the knowledge of the Lieutenant General commanding, which in his judgment palliated the offence of desertion, of which the man had been condemned, and warranted a suspension of his execution. The sentence of death was therefore annulled, and the man was pardoned and ordered to report to his regiment for duty. The poor fellow did not understand it at first, but when the truth burst upon him, he exclaimed, "Thank God! Thank God!" and the tears streamed down his face. The whole scene was most impressive, and was calculated to have a good effect upon all who were present. The other prisoner was executed at high noon in another locality. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, C.S.A., and Second Bishop of Tennessee, by Charles Todd Quintard. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Personal Narrative, Chickamauga. On the last day of June, 1863, Rosecrans began to advance on Bragg. That was the signal for our leaving Shelbyville. On the 3rd of July, the Union Army entered Tullahoma. On the morning of the 2nd, as I left the headquarters of General Bragg, I met my friend, Governor Isham G. Harris. He looked very bright and cheerful, and said to me, "Tomorrow morning you will be roused up by the thunder of our artillery." But instead of being thus aroused, I found myself in full retreat toward Winchester. Thence I rode to Cowan, where I found General Bragg and his staff, and General Polk with his staff. I rode up to them and said to General Bragg, "My dear General, I am afraid you are thoroughly outdone." "Yes," he said, "I am utterly broken down." And then, leaning over his saddle, he spoke of the loss of Middle Tennessee, and whispered, "This is a great disaster." I said to him, "General, don't be disheartened. Our turn will come next." I found Colonel Walters, his adjutant general, lying in the corner of a rail fence, with his hands under his head, looking the very picture of despair. I said to him, "My dear Colonel, what is the matter with you?" His reply was, "How can you ask such a question when you know as well as I do what has happened?" Our troops were at this time moving rapidly across the Sewanee Mountain, over country which subsequently became very familiar to me in times of peace. I said to him, "My dear Colonel, I am afraid you've not read the Psalms for the day." "No," he answered. "What do they say?" I replied in the words of the first verse of the 11th Psalm, "In the Lord put I my trust. How say ye then to my soul, that she should flee as a bird unto the hill?" I gave my horse to one of the boys, and at the request of General Bragg, I accompanied him by rail to Chattanooga. On the 21st of August, a day appointed by the President of the Confederate States for fasting, humiliation, and prayer, while I was preaching in a church, the Union Army appeared opposite Chattanooga and began shelling the town. I think my sermon on that occasion was not long. Early in September, General McCook and General Thomas moved in such a way as to completely flank the Confederate position. General Bragg immediately began his retreat southward, and having been joined by General Longstreet and his forces, attacked General Thomas at Lee and Gordon's Mills, 12 miles south of Chattanooga, on the 19th of September. It was a bitter fight, but the day closed without any decisive results to either side. After this, the great battle of Chickamauga was fought. Undoubtedly General Thomas saved the Union army from utter ruin, but Longstreet, by his prompt action in seizing an opportunity, won the victory for the Confederate army. The troops, led by Brigadier General Archibald Gracie, fired the last gun and stormed the last stronghold held by the enemy at the Battle of Chickamauga, and so memorable was his conduct on that day that the people in that vicinity have given the hill the name of Gracie Hill. It was a great privilege to know General Gracie as I did. He was a character that old Froissart would have delighted to paint. Chivalrous as a Bayard, he had all the tenderness of a woman. A warrior by nature as well as a soldier by education, he graduated at West Point in 1852, and profession, he had a horror of shedding blood, and would almost shed tears in the hour of victory over the thin ranks of his brigade. A few months before his death, he became a communicant of the Church. One great personal loss I sustained in the Battle of Chickamauga was that of my dear friend, Colonel W. B. Richmond, a member of General Polk's staff. He was a true friend, a thoroughly well-rounded character, and a most gallant soldier. He was the treasurer of the Diocese of Tennessee before the war. Brigadier General Helm of Kentucky was killed at Chickamauga, as was also Brigadier General Preston Smith. Among the dead was my cousin, Captain Thomas E. King of Roswell, Georgia, who had sufficiently recovered from his fearful wounds at the first battle of Manassas to act as honorary aide-de-camp to General Smith. Here also General Hood lost a leg. The day after the battle I was sent to the field with 150 ambulances to gather up the wounded. It was a sad duty. I saw many distressing sights. I was directed to convey the Federal wounded to the field hospitals fitted up by the Federal surgeons that had been captured, to the number of not less than 50, I think. I labored all the day, and at nightfall I came upon a wretched hut into which a half-dozen wounded men had dragged themselves. I found there among them a young fellow about 17 years of age. He had a severe wound in his leg, and a small bone had been torn away. I chatted with him pleasantly for a while, and promised to take him to the hospital early the next morning. Early the next day, when I went to fulfill my promise, I saw a surgeon's amputating knife on the head of a barrel by the door of the hut, and found that my young friend had been weeping bitterly. When I asked him what was the matter, he replied, "The surgeon has been examining my wound, and says that my leg must be amputated. I would not care for myself, but my poor mother—" and then he burst into an agony of tears. "Nonsense!" I said to him. "They shall not take off your leg." And lifting him up bodily, I placed him in an ambulance and took him to the hospital, where the next day I found him bright and cheerful. I learned subsequently that the surgeon who was about to amputate his leg unnecessarily was a doctor who had come up from Georgia to get a little practice in that line. The boy subsequently became a railway conductor, and used to say many years later, "You know, I belong to Bishop Quintard. He saved my leg, and perhaps my life, at Chickamauga. The leg young Sawbones was going to amputate is now as good as the other." Another warm friend of mine, John Marsh, was horribly wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga, so sorely wounded that he could not be removed from the field. A tent was erected over him, and I nursed him until he was in a condition to be taken to the hospital. On the 1st of October I obtained leave of absence from my duties as chaplain of Polk's corps, volunteered my services as an assistant surgeon, was assigned to duty as such at Marietta, Georgia, and reported as promptly as possible to Surgeon D. D. Saunders, who was in charge of the hospitals at that post. I took Marsh with me, and there he slowly recovered his health. I prepared him for baptism, and it was my great pleasure to baptize him and present him to Bishop Elliott for confirmation. When he was to be baptized, knowing that it would be painful for him to kneel because of his recent and scarcely healed wounds, I told him that he might sit in his chair. "No," he said, "let me kneel, let me kneel." And so he knelt, as I placed upon his brow the sign of the cross. Our victory was complete at Chickamauga, and Rosecrans' army threw down their arms and retreated pell-mell in the direction of Chattanooga. The Confederates followed on the 21st of September and took possession of Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain. For 2 months the two armies confronted each other at Chattanooga. Matters remained quiet in both armies until November, when the Confederate lines extended around Chattanooga from the mouth of Chattanooga Creek above to Moccasin Point below the town. To my great regret, General Polk was relieved of his command on the 29th of September in consequence of a misunderstanding with General Bragg, the commanding general. His application for a court of inquiry was dismissed, and a month later he was assigned to a new field of duty, alike important and difficult, the best evidence that President Davis could offer of his appreciation of the Bishop General's past services and of his expectations of his future career. It was while we were in Chattanooga, before the Battle of Chickamauga, that the Order of the Southern Cross was organized. There came to General Polk's headquarters, on whose staff I was serving, several officers who stated that they had been considering the propriety, if not the necessity, of instituting an organization within the Army, both social and charitable in its character, whose aim would be as a military brotherhood to foster patriotic sentiment, to strengthen the ties of Army fellowship, and at the same time to provide a fund, not only for the mutual benefit of its members, but for the relief of disabled soldiers and the widows and orphans of such as might perish in the Confederate service. They requested Bishop Polk to attend a meeting that evening to consider the subject further, and he, finding it inconvenient to attend, asked me to go as his representative, so I went. Some 6 or 8 of us met at Tyne's Station, about 9 miles northwest of Chattanooga. After sufficient discussion and explanation to bring us to a common understanding of the purposes of the proposed order, General Pat Cleburne, General John C. Brown, General Little, and myself were appointed a committee to draft a constitution and plan of organization. We met every day, I think, for a week or 10 days, and the outcome of our labors was a little pamphlet, in appearance similar to the catechisms of our Sunday school days. It was, in fact, 3 by 5 inches in size, containing 25 pages, and was from the press of Burke, Boykin & Company, Macon, Georgia. It was entitled Constitution of the Comrades of the Southern Cross, adopted August 28, 1863. Several companies were at once organized, and but for the unfavorable course of events, I do not doubt that the order would have rapidly extended throughout the armies of the Confederacy. But active military operations were very soon afterward begun, and the army was kept constantly on the move until the bottom dropped out, and the Order of the Southern Cross, like the Southern Confederacy, went to pieces. The Confederate Veterans Organization subsequently embodied some of the features which it was intended that the comrades of the Southern Cross should possess. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, C.S.A., and 2nd Bishop of Tennessee, by Charles Todd Quintard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Personal Narrative, Atlanta. General Bragg was defeated by General Grant at Chattanooga in November, 1863, and early in the following month he was, at his own request, relieved of the command of the Confederate Army. He was called to Richmond to act for a while as military adviser to President Davis. His life subsequent to the war was quiet. He was a God-fearing man in peace and in war. He died in 1876. He was succeeded in the command by General Joseph E. Johnston, whose army was encamped in and around Atlanta. Soon afterward I secured the use of a Methodist church building on the corner of Garnett and Forsyth Street, assembled a congregation, held services, and instituted a work which resulted in the establishment of St. Luke's Parish. A suitable lot was soon obtained, and with the help of men detailed from the army, a building was speedily erected. It was a most attractive building, handsomely furnished, and although somewhat Confederate in style, would have compared favorably with most churches built in the days of peace and prosperity. Within its portals, devout worshipers, many distinguished Confederate officers among them, were delighted to turn aside from the bloody strife of war and bow themselves before the throne of grace. On the 8th of May, 1864, while I was in Atlanta, in charge of St. Luke's Church, and in attendance upon the hospitals, the following telegram came to me from Major Henry Hampton: "Can't you come up tomorrow? General Hood wishes to be baptized." It was impossible for me to go, but it was a great pleasure for me to learn afterwards that General Polk arrived with his staff that day, and that night he baptized his brother general. It was the eve of an expected battle. It was a touching sight, we may be sure, the one-legged veteran leaning upon his crutches to receive the waters of baptism and the sign of the cross. A few nights later General Polk baptized General Johnston and Lieutenant General Hardee, General Hood being witness. These were two of the 4 ecclesiastical acts performed by Bishop Polk after receiving his commission in the army. I was then chaplain at large under the appointment of the general commanding. Being anxious for the Bishop of Georgia to consecrate the new church, I arranged for him to visit that portion of the army then at Dalton. At Dalton I baptized Brigadier General Strahl in his camp in the presence of his assembled brigade, and at night we held services in the Methodist church at Dalton. The church was so densely packed that it was impossible for Bishop Elliott and myself to enter by the front door. Fortunately, there was a small door in the rear of the church opening into what I should call the chancel. We were obliged to vest ourselves in the open air. I crawled through the little doorway first, and then, taking the Bishop by his right hand, did all I could to help him through. I read evening prayer, and the Bishop preached. After which I presented a class for confirmation, in which were General Hardee, General Strahl, 2 other generals, a number of officers of the line, and many privates. The next day I accompanied the Bishop to Marietta, where he held an ordination service, at which I preached the sermon; and the day following he consecrated to the service of Almighty God St. Luke's Church, Atlanta. In the afternoon of that day I presented a class of 5 persons to the Bishop for confirmation, the first fruits of my labors in St. Luke's Parish. It was about this time that I prepared some little books adapted to the use of the soldiers as a convenient substitute for the Book of Common Prayer. I also prepared a booklet entitled "Balm for the Weary and Wounded." It was through the great kindness and generosity of Mr. Jacob K. Sass, the Treasurer of the General Council of the Church in the Confederate States, that I was enabled to publish these 2 little volumes. The first 4 copies of the latter booklet that came from the press were forwarded to General Polk, and he wrote upon 3 of them the names of General J. E. Johnston, Lieutenant General Hardee, and Lieutenant General Hood, respectively, and "with the compliments of Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, June 12, 1864." They were taken from the breast pocket of his coat, stained with his blood after his death, and forwarded to the officers for whom he had intended them. On the 14th of June I telegraphed to General Polk from Atlanta that I would visit him at his headquarters and give him the Blessed Sacrament. 2 telegrams came to me that day. One was from Major Mason and read as follows: "Lieutenant General Polk's remains leave here on the 12 o'clock train and will go directly through to Augusta." The other was as follows: "To the Rev. Dr. Quintard, Atlanta, Georgia. Lieutenant General Polk was killed today by a cannon ball. His body goes down to Atlanta today. Be at the depot to meet it and watch the trains. Douglas West, AAG." I was never more shocked and overwhelmed. On reaching Atlanta, the body of the dead Bishop and General was escorted to St. Luke's Church and placed in front of the altar. He was dressed in his gray uniform. On his breast rested a cross of white roses, and beside his casket lay his sword. Throughout the following morning, thousands of soldiers and citizens came to pay their last respects of affection. At noon, assisted by the Rev. John W. Beckwith of Demopolis, afterwards Bishop of Georgia, I held funeral services and made an address. The body was then escorted to the railway station by the dead general's personal staff, together with General G. W. Smith, General Wright, General Ruggles, General Reynolds, Colonel Ewell, and many officers of the army, soldiers, and citizens, and a committee representing the city of Atlanta. At Augusta the body remained 2 days at St. Paul's Church, and lay in state at the City Hall until St. Peter's Day, June 29th, when the final rites were held in St. Paul's Church. The Bishops of Georgia, Mississippi, and Arkansas officiated. The sermon was by the Bishop of Georgia. The burial was in the chancel of the church. Bishop Polk's was the first funeral to take place in St. Luke's Church, Atlanta. There was but one other, that of a child named after and baptized by Bishop Elliot, for whom Bishop Polk had stood as sponsor but a short time before. In August 1864 I was in Macon, Georgia, not knowing precisely what to do or where to go. The times were very distressing. I took charge of the church and parish in Macon for the rector, who had been sick, but was slowly recovering. This was in accordance with a letter from the Bishop of Georgia, who had written me about the middle of the previous month that I had been sadly tossed about and needed rest, and that I might go to Macon for that purpose. But a few days later I was with Bishop Lay of Arkansas in Atlanta, and with the army again, though compelled to go on Sundays to Macon to officiate for the sick rector at that place. I remained at General Hood's headquarters in Atlanta, expecting to move with the general into Tennessee. The city was being shelled by the Federals, and some of the shells fell very thickly about the general's headquarters. I thought the locality seemed very unhealthy, but as the general and his staff did not seem in the least disturbed, Bishop Lay and I concluded that everything was going on all right according to the art of war, and we stood it with the best of them. On one particular day, when more shells were thrown than in all the other days put together, there were, strange to say, no casualties. On the 10th of August, at headquarters, I presented a class to Bishop Lay for confirmation. It included General Hood and some officers of his staff. In speaking to me the night before his confirmation, the general said, "Doctor, I have 2 objects in life that engage my supreme regard. One is to do all I can for my country. The other is to be ready and prepared for death whenever God shall call me." Learning that St. Luke's Church had been injured in the bombardment of the city, Bishop Lay and I made a visit to it. We looked in wonder at the sight that met our eyes upon our entering the sacred edifice. One of the largest shells had torn through the side of the building and struck the prayer desk on which the large Bible happened to be lying. The prayer desk was broken, and the Bible fell under it and upon the shell, so as apparently to smother it and prevent its exploding. I lifted up the Bible and removed the shell, and gathered up all the prayer books I could find for the soldiers in the camps. Before leaving the church, I sat in one of the seats for a few moments and thought of the dear friends who had assisted in the building of the church, and who had offered up the sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving in that place; of the bishop who had but a short time before consecrated it; of the bishop general over whom I had said the burial service there; of the now scattered flock and the utter desolation of God's house. As I rose to go, I picked up a handkerchief that had been dropped there at the child's funeral, which was the last service held there. I wrote a little story subsequently about Nellie Peters' pocket handkerchief and what it saw, and it was published in the columns of the Church Intelligencer. This was the last time I visited St. Luke's Church, of which I have such tender memories. It was destroyed in the burning of Atlanta. On the 6th of September, 1864, a general pass was issued to me by order of General Hood and signed by General F.A. Shoup, his chief of staff. This pass is an interesting relic of my early associations with one who, subsequent to the war, came under my jurisdiction as a priest of the church when I was Bishop of Tennessee. He married a daughter of Bishop Elliot, took orders in the church, so distinguished himself in the ministry as to receive the degree of Doctor of Divinity, and was for a long time my neighbor at Sewanee, where he was a professor in the University of the South. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, C.S.A., and 2nd Bishop of Tennessee, by Charles Todd Quintard. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Personal Narrative, Columbus, Georgia, and the Journey into Tennessee. When the fall of Atlanta seemed imminent, General Johnston advised me to remove my family from the city, and I decided to go to Columbus, Georgia. The rector of Trinity Church in that town was ill, and the Bishop of Georgia appointed me a missionary to the army, at a stipend of $3,000 per year, to be paid as long as the churches in Georgia remained open, and to be continued to me while I was in Columbus, and while the Reverend Mr. Hawks, rector of Trinity Church, was ill. My appointment was subsequently made that of permanent missionary to the army. So in October, 1864, I rented a very comfortable house 2 miles from town, for which I paid rent in advance for 9 months, $2,500 Confederate money. But everything seemed to be on the same generous scale, for when on the Sunday after my arrival I preached in Trinity Church, the offerings for the poor amounted to $1,000. We met with great cordiality from all the people of the town, especially from Mr. J. Rhodes Brown, who placed me under great obligations by his kindness. We met in Columbus the musical prodigy, Blind Tom, who belonged to one of our neighbors, General Bethune. I had heard him in a public performance 2 years previously in Richmond. I was calling on the Bethunes one day, and on hearing my voice, Tom came into the parlor and in the most uncouth way paid his respects to the ladies and myself. He was not as much as usual in the humor for playing, having already spent 4 hours at the piano that day for the amusement of some cavalrymen who had visited him. Nevertheless, he cheerfully sat down to the piano and gave us some delightful music, and sang us some French songs, in which his powers of mimicry were wonderfully displayed. His playing was most marvelous. It seemed as though inspired. He was then a lad of 15. His musical talents were exhibited in his earliest childhood. During all the month of October I was in constant attendance upon the sick and wounded in the hospitals of Columbus, and holding daily religious services in my capacity of missionary to the army. My brother-in-law, Dr. H. M. Anderson, having been ordered to Selma with the Polk Hospital, to which he was attached, spent a week with me and did much to assist me in my medical services. Greatly to my satisfaction, he afterwards received orders to report for duty to the hospitals in Columbus. One day at the Carnes Hospital, in the presence of a large number of surgeons and convalescents, I baptized an infant. That day was made ever memorable by the generous donation of my friend, Mr. J. Rhodes Brown, who handed me $1,000 to be appropriated to the purchase of reading matter for the army. He also presented me with a pair of blankets for my own use, and subsequently with 300 yards of excellent cloth to clothe my regiment. To this he thoughtfully added buttons, thread, and lining, and 300 pairs of socks. The cloth at that time was valued at $45 a yard. The liberal soul shall be made fat. About the middle of October, General G.P.T. Beauregard assumed command of the military division east of the Mississippi River, including the Department of Tennessee and Georgia, commanded by General Hood, who, however, was to retain command of his department. On assuming command, General Beauregard published an address to his army in excellent tone and taste, promising a forward movement. It caused great enthusiasm. The general was very popular with his troops, and his name was a tower of strength. On the 8th of November, Captain Wickham informed me that he would leave for the army on the morrow, and I immediately made my arrangements to accompany him. Leaving Columbus on a freight train after a long and wearying journey, we reached Montgomery, Alabama, and found accommodations, or what passed for such, in the topmost story of the principal hotel. While in Montgomery, I dined at Dr. Scott's in company with a number of Tennessee friends, among whom were Colonel Battle, late in command of the 20th Tennessee, and then State Treasurer; Colonel Ray, Secretary of State; General Dunlap, Comptroller; Henry Watterson and Albert Roberts, who then edited the Montgomery Mail. Colonel Battle followed me after I left the house and handed me a roll of bills, which he begged me to accept from Colonel Ray, General Dunlap, and himself, to assist me in the defraying my expenses. The money came very opportunely, and I thanked him very heartily, for I had not $5 in my pocket at the time. I took a steamer for Selma. The vessel was crowded to excess, in the cabin, on the deck, and all about the guards. Still, I had a much pleasanter night than I anticipated, on the floor of the cabin. At Selma I met the Reverend Dr. Ticknor, who handed me a letter from my dear friend the Bishop of Alabama, containing a check for $500, which he begged me to accept for my own comfort. I left for Demopolis at 8 the following morning in company with Captain Wickham and my friend Major Thomas Peters, formerly of General Polk's staff. At Demopolis I had the pleasure of seeing the Reverend John W. Beckwith, who had officiated with me at the funeral of General Polk, and who was afterwards to become the Bishop of Georgia. Continuing on our journey, we sailed down the Tombigbee River to the terminus of the railway, where we took cars and started for Meridian, Mississippi. It was a most tedious trip on the river, taking up about 10 hours to make 50 miles, and when we reached the cars, we found them crowded to excess. I stopped at Macon, Mississippi, to visit Captain Yates, who had lost his leg at Atlanta, and to whom I had ministered there. I met the heartiest of welcomes, and found the captain greatly improved and getting about a little on crutches. His nephew, who had lost a leg at Murfreesboro, was visiting him. I started off from Macon with abundant supplies furnished by Mrs. Yates, among which were 2 roast turkeys, a ham, and all the etceteras. When the train came along I found Major Winter of the Engineers in the car with his baggage and implements. He kindly invited me to a seat, and I had a comfortable ride to Okolona, Mississippi. It having been decided not to go forward until General Cheatham could be heard from, Captain Wickham, Captain Bradford, and I went to Columbus, Mississippi, where I was very cordially received by Bishop Green of Mississippi. Wednesday, the 16th of November, having been set apart by the President of the Confederate States as a day of supplication and prayer for God's blessing on our cause, I officiated in St. Paul's Church, Columbus, and preached from the text, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." General Cheatham telegraphed me to go forward, so I left West Point, Mississippi, on the 19th of November, in a car loaded with corn. The party on our car included Brigadier General Quarles, Sterling Cockrell of Nashville, Captains Shute, Wickham, Bradford, Jones, Merritt, and Colonel Young of the 49th Tennessee Regiment, besides some ladies and young people. The day wore away pleasantly enough in such company, and about 8 o'clock at night we reached Corinth, Mississippi, where the Reverend Mr. Markham, an excellent Presbyterian minister from New Orleans, shared my blankets with me. Here we had information that General Sherman was making his way to the seaboard, and was within 30 miles of Macon, Georgia. Captain Wickham and myself passed on with others, and at 4:30 in the evening of Thursday, the 22nd of November, we crossed the line into Tennessee. In consequence of the wretched condition of the roads and the rough weather, we had had a hard time of it. I made my way with all possible speed through Mount Pleasant to Ashwood and to the house of my dear friend General Lucius Polk. Such greetings as I received! How I thanked God for the friends he had given me! General Chalmers and his staff were guests at General Polk's, and the next day we had many happy meetings. All day long there was a constant stream of visitors to Hamilton Place, the residence of General Polk. General Hood and Governor Harris came early in the day, as did also General Cheatham. Then came General John C. Brown, General Gibson, General Bate, handsome Frank Armstrong, and General Waddell, who with his staff spent the night with us. I offered a special prayer of thanksgiving to God for our return to Tennessee, and the following day was one of supreme enjoyment. I did not move out of the house, but just rested and tried to realize that I was once more in Tennessee. On the 27th, Advent Sunday, I had morning prayer at the residence of General Lucius Polk, and baptized 2 children, making a record of the same in the parish register. On the following day our forces entered Columbia. I accompanied them, and found the good people of the town in a state of the wildest enthusiasm. Almost the first person I met was my dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Pease, who went with me to call on several families. These were days of great hopefulness. General Beauregard telegraphed to General Hood that Sherman was making his way rapidly to the Atlantic coast, and urged Hood to advance to relieve General Lee. General Hood proposed to press forward with all possible speed, and said to me confidentially that he would either beat the enemy to Nashville or make the latter go there double quick. So the race began to see who would get to Nashville first. That night the enemy was still on the opposite side of Duck River, but it was thought he would withdraw next morning. At all events, our forces were to cross at daylight. General Hood urged me to go with the ambulance. When he told me good-bye, I prayed God's blessing, guidance, and direction upon him. "Thank you, Doctor," he replied. "That is my hope and trust." And as he turned away, he remarked, "The enemy must give me fight, or I will be in Nashville before tomorrow night." General Cheatham and General Stuart crossed Duck River at sunrise, General Lee shortly afterwards. There was considerable shelling of the town, and Colonel Beckham was wounded, but no lives were lost. By Wednesday the enemy had all withdrawn, our forces had crossed over, and the wagons were crossing. I crossed the river at 2 o'clock with Major John Green of South Carolina and Dr. Phillips of Hoxton's artillery. We met on the road several hundred prisoners going to the rear. At Spring Hill we heard that the Federal commanders were in a sad way. General Stanley had been heard to say, "I can do nothing more, I must retreat." 3 trains of cars were burned by the Federals at this place. Very much has been said about the Confederates' lost opportunity, as it is called, at Spring Hill, and General Cheatham has been faulted for not doing something very brilliant there that would have changed the whole complexion of affairs. It is said that he failed to give battle when the enemy was marching along the road almost under the campfires of the main body of our army. During the war and after its close, I was brought into such intimate association with General B.F. Cheatham that I learned to appreciate his high character. He was a man of admirable presence. In manner he was free, without frivolity, cheerful, kind-hearted, and ever easy of access. He was a gentleman without pretensions, and a politician without deceit. A faithful friend and a generous foe. Strong in his attachments and rational in his resentments. He was clear in judgment, firm in purpose, and courageous as a lion. He was fruitful in expedients, prompt in action, and always ready for a fight. He won victory on many a well-contested field, but best of all, he ruled his own spirit. He participated in the greater number of battles in the war with Mexico, and in the Civil War he won distinction and promotion at Belmont, Shiloh, Perryville, Murfreesboro, Chickamauga, and on many fields besides. He exhibited the most perfect self-possession, the utmost disregard of peril. He possessed in an eminent degree the indispensable quality of a soldier which enabled him to go wherever duty or necessity demanded his presence. He understood thoroughly that it was better that a leader should lose his life than his honor. I have every confidence in the statement he once made: "During my services as a soldier under the flag of my country in Mexico, and as an officer of the Confederate armies, I cannot recall an instance where I failed to obey an order literally, promptly, and faithfully." Major Saunders of French's division has said, "The assumption that Schofield's army would have been destroyed at Spring Hill, and one of the most brilliant victories of the war achieved, had it not been for the misconduct of Cheatham, is one of the delusions that has survived the war. No circumstance or incident that his strategy developed can be found that justifies the attacks made on the military reputation of General Cheatham." My own opinion has always been that General Cheatham was in no way at fault in his conduct at Spring Hill, and this opinion has been strengthened by the letter from Governor Harris to Governor James D. Porter, dated May 20, 1877, and the brief letter from General Hood to Cheatham, dated December 13, 1864, both recently published in Southern Historical Papers, Volume 9, page 532. I baptized General Cheatham, confirmed him, officiated at his marriage, and it was my sad privilege to say the burial service over him. He died in Nashville, Tennessee, September 4th, 1886. His last words were, "Bring me my horse, I'm going to the front." Just before moving toward Franklin, General Strahl came to me and said, "I want to make you a present," and presented me with a splendid horse named the Lady Polk. I used the horse throughout the remainder of the war, and at its close sold her, and with the money erected in St. James Church, Bolivar, Tennessee, a memorial window to General Strahl and his adjutant, Lieutenant John Marsh, both of them killed in the fearful battle of Franklin. Both of these men I had baptized but a few months previously, and both were confirmed by Bishop Elliot. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, C.S.A., and Second Bishop of Tennessee, by Charles Todd Quintard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Personal Narrative, Franklin. The Battle of Franklin was fought on the 30th of November, 1864, and was one of the bloodiest of the war. On that dismal November day our line of battle was formed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and marched directly down through an open field toward the outer breastworks of the enemy. A sheet of fire was pouring into the very faces of our men. The command was, "Forward, forward, men!" Never on earth did men fight against greater odds, but they advanced towards the breastworks, on, and met death without flinching. The roar of battle was kept up until after midnight, and then gradually died away, as the enemy abandoned their interior line of defenses and rapidly retreated to Nashville. We had about 23,000 men engaged. They fought with great gallantry, drove the enemy from their outer line of temporary works into their interior line, captured several stands of colors, and about 1,000 prisoners. But our losses were about 4,500 brave men, and among them Major General Pat Cleburne, Brigadier General John Adams, Brigadier General O.F. Strahl, Brigadier General Gist, Brigadier General Granberry, and Brigadier General John C. Carter was mortally wounded. Among the wounded were Major General John C. Brown, Brigadier Generals Manigault, Quarles, Cockrell, Scott, and George Gordon. General John Adams, on reaching the vicinity of Franklin, had immediately formed his line of battle near the residence of Colonel John McGavock, and led his troops into the fight. A more gallant set of officers and men never faced a foe. General Adams was calm, cool, and self-possessed, and vigilantly watched and directed the movements of his men, and led them on for victory or for death. He was severely wounded early in the action, and was urged to leave the field. He calmly replied, "No, I will not. I will see my men through," and at the same time gave an order to Captain Thomas Gibson, his aide-de-camp and brigade inspector. When he fell, he was in the act of leaping his horse, Old Charlie, over the outer works. Both horse and his rider were instantly killed, the general falling within our lines, while Old Charlie lay astride the works. The general received 2 wounds in the right leg, 4 balls entered his body, 1 ball passed through his breast, and 1 entered his right shoulder blade. These wounds were all received simultaneously, and his death was instantaneous. Major General Cleburne's mare was dead on the works, and the general himself was pierced with no less than 49 bullets. The bodies of these 2 brave generals were brought from the battlefield in an ambulance and taken to the residence of Colonel McGavock, whose house and grounds were literally filled with the Confederate dead and wounded. Mrs. McGavock rendered every assistance possible, and her name deserves to be handed down to future generations as that of a woman of lofty principle, exalted character, and untiring devotion. Captain Gibson, General Adams' aide and brigade inspector, although badly wounded, accompanied by Captain Blackwell, conveyed the body of his commander to the residence of the general's brother, Major Nathan Adams, in Pulaski. I officiated at the funeral, and his mortal remains were placed in the cemetery by the side of those of his father and mother. As a soldier, General Adams was active, calm, and self-possessed, brave without rashness, quick to perceive, and ever ready to seize the favorable moment. He enjoyed the confidence of his superiors and the love and respect of his soldiers and officers. In camp and on the march he looked closely to the comfort of his soldiers, and often shared his horse on long marches with his sick and broken down men. He was a member of the Episcopal Church and a sincere and humble Christian. For a year or more before his death he engaged, morning, noon, and night, in devotional exercises. He invariably fasted on Friday and other days of abstinence appointed by the Book of Common Prayer. He was guided in all his actions by a thoughtful and strict regard for truth, right, and duty. In all the relations of life he was upright, just, and pure. There is no shadow on his memory, and he left to his children the heritage of an unblemished name, and to coming generations the sublime heroism of a Southern soldier. After the battle, General Strahl's horse lay by the roadside, and the general by his side, both dead. All his staff were killed. General Strahl was a native of Ohio, but he had come to Tennessee in his youth, and was as thoroughly identified with the latter State as any of her sons. He gave to the 4th Tennessee Regiment its drill and discipline, and made it a noted regiment before he succeeded General A. P. Stewart in command of a brigade. He was just recovering from a dangerous wound received at Atlanta the previous July, when he entered upon the Tennessee campaign, which ended for him fatally. General Gist of South Carolina was lying dead with his sword still grasped in his hand and reaching across the fatal breastworks. General Granberry of Texas and his horse were seen on the top of the breastworks, horse and rider dead. I went back to Columbia, hired a negro to make some plain coffins, helped him to put them into a wagon, drove with him about 16 miles, and buried these brave men, Strahl, Gist, and Granberry, under the shadow of the ivy-mantled tower of St. John's Church, Ashwood, with the services of the church. Then I returned to the field. Major General John C. Brown, General George Gordon, and General Carter were seriously wounded, the last named mortally. After ministering to these and many another, I returned to Columbia to the hospital in the Columbia Institute. Here I found Captain William Flournoy and Adjutant McKinney of the 1st Tennessee Regiment, both severely wounded. There were hundreds of wounded in the Institute. I buried Major General Cleburne from the residence of Mrs. William Polk. A military escort was furnished by Captain Long, and every token of respect was shown to the memory of the glorious dead. After the funeral, I rode out to Hamilton Place with General Lucius Polk. There I found General Manigault wounded in the head, and Major Prince of Mobile wounded in the foot. Returning to Columbia, I met Captain Stapleton, and through him paid the burial expenses of my dear friend John Marsh, $300. The dear fellow had given me a farewell kiss as he entered the battle. I also gave the Rev. Dr. Pease $100 and left myself without funds. While in Columbia, I sent wagons down to the Webster settlement to procure supplies for our wounded at Franklin. Having visited the sick and wounded in the hospitals at Columbia, I went with Captain Stapleton towards Franklin. I reached the house of Mr. Harrison, about 3 miles from Franklin, at dark, and stopped to see my friends, General Carter, General Quarles, Captain Tom Henry, and Captain Matt Pilcher. Captain Pilcher was shot in the side. Captain Henry was wounded slightly in the head. Both were doing well. General Quarles had his left arm shattered. General Carter was shot through the body, and his wound was mortal. I knelt by the side of the wounded and commended them to God. I had prayers with the family before retiring. All that night we could hear the guns around Nashville very distinctly, but all I could learn in the morning was that our lines were within 1.5 miles of the city. The following day was the second Sunday in Advent, December 4th. I rode to Franklin to see Dr. Buist, the post surgeon. All along the way were abundant marks of the terrific battle, dead horses and burnt wagons, but at the line of the breastworks near Mr. Carter's house, where the heaviest fighting was done, there was a great number of horses piled almost one upon another. Mr. Carter's son was shot within a few yards of his home. Returning to Mr. Harrison's house with Dr. Buist, who went down to attend to the wounded, I visited them all and had prayers with them. The doctor and myself returned to Franklin in the evening, and William Clouston called and took me to his house for the night. There I found General Cockrell of Missouri, wounded in the legs and in the right arm, but full of life and very cheerful. Lieutenant Anderson, one of his staff, who had lost a part of one foot at Vicksburg, was now wounded in the other. Captain John M. Hickey, in command of a company in a Missouri regiment, while charging the main lines of the works just in front of the cotton gin, was desperately wounded, his leg being shattered. He fell into the mud, and while in this deplorable condition, his left arm was badly broken by a Minnie ball, and soon afterwards he was shot in the shoulder. With thousands of dead and wounded lying around him, he lay upon the field of battle for 15 hours without food, water, or shelter in the freezing cold, and half of that time exposed to the plunging shot and shell of both friend and foe. I devoted my time while in Franklin to visiting the hospitals. In one room of Brown's Division Hospital in the courthouse, I dressed a goodly number of wounds, after which I went to visit General Cockrell, and thence to Army Headquarters at the residence of John Overton. I met with a most cordial welcome, not only from General Hood, but also from Mr. Overton's family, and several ladies from Nashville. On Wednesday I rode with Governor Harris to Franklin, and thence to Mr. Harrison's to be with General John C. Carter, who was nearing his end. I found General Quarles and Captain Pilcher both doing well. Major Dunlap was also improving. Lieutenant Colonel Jones of the 24th South Carolina, however, was not doing so well, having had a profuse hemorrhage. On visiting General Carter, I read a short passage of Holy Scripture and had prayers with him, for which he thanked me in the most earnest manner. In his lucid moments, my conversation with him was exceedingly interesting, but his paroxysms of pain were frequent and intense, and he craved for chloroform, and it was freely administered to him. He could not be convinced that he was going to die. "But," I said, "General, if you should die, what do you wish me to say to your wife?" "Tell her," he replied, "that I have always loved her devotedly, and regret leaving her more than I can express." I had prayers with all the wounded and with the family of Mr. Harrison, and sat up with General Carter until half past 12 o'clock. Lieutenant Colonel Jones died some time in the night. General Carter died the following Saturday. I wrote to the Rev. Dr. Pease at Columbia to attend his funeral, as his body was to be taken there for temporary burial. It was bitterly cold and the roads were very slippery. General Carter was a native of Georgia, but a citizen of Tennessee. He had been advanced for merit from a lieutenant at the beginning of the war to the command of a brigade. He had a wonderful gentleness of manner, coupled with dauntless courage. Every field officer of his brigade but one was killed, wounded, or captured on the enemy's works at the dreadful battle of Franklin. The following Sunday, third Sunday in Advent, I celebrated the Holy Communion at Army Headquarters. That night General Forrest shared my bed with me. One of the men remarked, "It was the lion and the lamb lying down together." The following day, in the Methodist Church at Brentwood, I united in the holy bonds of matrimony Major William Clare and Miss Mary Hadley of Nashville. The Major's attendants were Dr. Ford, Medical Director, and Major Moore, Chief Commissary. A large number of officers were present. After the marriage, the party returned to the residence of Mr. Overton, where a sumptuous dinner was provided. My empty purse was replenished by a fee of $200, besides which a friend sent me the following morning $50 in greenbacks. I left headquarters the following day in Dr. Ford's ambulance for Franklin, and on the way picked up a couple of wounded men and carried them to the hospital. We met Governor Harris and Colonel Ray, Secretary of State. I spent the evening at Mrs. Carter's with my friends, Colonel Rice and Captain Tom Henry. The next day I made efforts to purchase shoes for my family. The merchants had hidden their goods and were unwilling to dispose of them for Confederate money. But by offering to pay in greenbacks, I not only secured shoes, but all sorts of goods. Meeting Captain Kelly of the Rock City Guard, then off duty in consequence of wounds received in the recent battle, I proposed to him to go to Georgia for clothing for the soldiers. To this he agreed, and we left for Columbia. While there, I attended a meeting of the ladies, the object of which was to organize a relief association. Distressing reports began to come in of a reverse to our arms at Nashville. At first I did not credit them, but later I met Colonel Harvey, the Inspector General, who not only confirmed the very worst of the reports, but expressed both indignation and disgust at the conduct of our troops. General Lucius Polk sent a buggy for me, and I drove out to Hamilton Place and spent the night. The next day, fourth Sunday in Advent, I celebrated the Holy Communion in the parlor at Hamilton Place, and after administering to the company assembled there, carried the consecrated elements to the rooms of General Manigault and Major Prince, that they might also receive the comfortable sacrament. In the afternoon I drove back to Columbia and assisted the Rev. Dr. Pease at the marriage of Miss Huggs to Major William E. Moore, Chief Commissary of the Army. After this I rode to the residence of Mr. Vaught, where I found General Hood and his staff. I was glad to find the General bearing up well under the disaster to our arms. It was now a very serious question whether General Hood should hold the line of Duck River, even if it were possible for him to do so, or fall back across the Tennessee. One officer remarked to the General in my presence that while God was on our side so manifestly that no man could question it, it was still very apparent that our people had not yet passed through all their sufferings. The General replied that the remark was a just one. He had been impressed with the fact at Spring Hill, where the enemy was completely within our grasp, and notwithstanding all his efforts to strike a decisive blow, he had failed. And now again at Nashville, after the day's fighting was well nigh over, when all had gone successfully until the evening, our troops had broken in confusion and fled. Early the following morning General Forrest reached headquarters and advised strongly that General Hood withdraw without delay south of the Tennessee. "If we are unable to hold the State, we should at once evacuate it," were the words of General Forrest. At 9 o'clock in the morning, cannonading began at Rutherford Hill. After a couple of hours, word came from General Cheatham that he had repulsed the enemy and the firing ceased. General Hood finally decided to fall back south of the Tennessee, and Governor Harris, in whose judgment I had great confidence, thought it the best we could do. Still, it was a dark day to me, and the thought of leaving the State of Tennessee once more greatly depressed me. Tuesday, the 20th of December, was a day of gloominess. I felt in bidding farewell to Columbia that I was parting with my dearest and most cherished hopes. I recalled the days of our march into Tennessee, so full of delightful intercourse with Strahl and Marsh and other friends. After saying good-bye, I rode on to Pulaski, 30 miles, where I was cordially received at the home of Mrs. Ballentine. The next day I baptized 6 persons there, and later at the headquarters of General Hood, in the residence of the Honorable Thomas Jones, 4 of Mr. Jones' children. After this baptism, Mr. Jones joined us at prayers in General Hood's room. The General said, "I am afraid that I have been more wicked since I began this retreat than for a long time past. I had so set my heart upon success, had prayed so earnestly for it, had such a firm trust that I should succeed, that my heart has been very rebellious. But," he added, "let us go out of Tennessee singing hymns of praise." The weather was exceeding inclement. So many of our poor boys were barefooted that there was very great suffering. The citizens of Pulaski did all they could to provide shoes. I dined on Wednesday with Governor Harris at Major Nathan Adams, and spent the night with Colonel Rice. The General informed me the next day that the enemy effected a crossing of Duck River at Columbia at noon, and began shelling the town. But Forrest told them by flag that if the shelling were not stopped, he would put their wounded directly under the fire. The firing consequently ceased. Our forces all moved on towards Bainbridge. General Hood left the following morning. I joined Governor Harris, as he was not to be detained en route. We rode 30 miles to a little town called Lexington, where Colonel Rice, Captain Ballentine, and myself obtained rough accommodation for the night. The next day we started for Lamb's Ferry, thinking to find a boat there, but learned that General Roddy had ordered it to Elk River to cross his command. I therefore had another journey of 18 miles to make. Just at the close of the day I found my friend Major General Clayton camped by the roadside, and not knowing General Hood's location, I decided to accept General Clayton's very cordial invitation to spend the night with him. It was Christmas Eve. After supper the General called up all his staff and couriers, and we had prayers. The next day, Christmas Day and Sunday, was very sad and gloomy. I had prayers at General Clayton's headquarters, after which I rode down to the river and watched the work of putting down the pontoons. Someone brought me a Christmas gift of 2 $5 gold pieces from Mrs. Thomas Jones of Pulaski. The following day I crossed the river at 9 o'clock. On crossing the river on our forward march, I had sung Jubilate. Now I was chanting De Profundis. I joined General Hood at Tuscumbia on the 27th, and found the General feeling the disaster more since he reached Tuscumbia than at any time since the retreat began, and after various adventures I reached Aberdeen on Saturday, the last day of 1864. Though an entire stranger in Aberdeen, I received a most cordial welcome at the home of Mr. Needham Whitfield, whose family were church people, and thus ended the year 1864. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, C.S.A., and 2nd Bishop of Tennessee, by Charles Todd Quintard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Personal Narrative, The Crumbling of the Confederacy. New Year's Day fell on a Sunday in 1865. There being no resident priest in Aberdeen, the vestry of St. John's Church requested me to officiate for them, which I did both morning and evening, having large congregations. And on the following Tuesday I began holding daily services in the church, which were exceedingly well attended. At the first of these services I preached on Earnestness in the Christian Life. I remained in Aberdeen until the 14th of January, holding daily services, visiting the members of the parish, and performing such priestly offices as were desired. Then I left for Columbus, Mississippi, where I had a cordial welcome at the house of Mr. John C. Ramsey, a vestryman of St. Paul's Church. The bishop of the diocese, Bishop Green, was making Columbus his home, but was absent at the time, and expected to return on the following Monday. I met the Reverend Mr. Schroer of Tennessee at the bishop's residence, and on the following Sunday I preached at St. Paul's Church, both morning and night, the services being taken by the Reverend Mr. Schroer and the Reverend Mr. Bakewell of New Orleans. I held services daily, morning and evening during that week, at most of which I preached. At this time the minds of the people of the South were becoming impressed with the idea that the victory and independence of the Confederate States were no longer certain. On the 19th of January, General Hood was relieved of his command, and Lieutenant General Taylor took temporary command. Both officers and privates were holding meetings in the army asking for the return of General Johnston. General Hood deserved well of his country for his bravery, for his devotion, for his energy and enterprise, but the troops longed for General Joseph E. Johnston, the country was crying out for him, and Congress of the Confederate States was demanding that the President restore him to the command of the Army of the Tennessee. And I am satisfied that no other man, had he the genius of a Caesar or a Napoleon, could have commanded that army so well as General Johnston. On Sunday, the 22nd of January, the Reverend John M. Schroer, deacon, was advanced to the priesthood in St. Paul's Church, Columbus, by Bishop Green. I presented him for ordination and preached the sermon from the text, "What shall one then answer the messengers of the nation? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it." Isaiah 14:32. It saddened me to think that because of the death of Bishop Otey of Tennessee, Mr. Schroer had need to be ordained outside of the diocese to which he belonged canonically. But after the close of the war and I had become Bishop Otey's successor, Mr. Schroer was one of my most faithful and beloved clergymen, was for several years secretary of the Diocese of Tennessee, and missionary in charge of several important places near Memphis. In the epidemic of yellow fever in 1878, he remained bravely at his post and died of the fever. A few days after the ordination, I met at General Elzey's Colonel Baskerville, Captain Hudson, James D.B. DeBow, and others, and we discussed the policy of putting the negroes into the army as our soldiers, and we all agreed to the wisdom of so doing. We also discussed the rumors, then current, of the readiness of the foreign powers to recognize us on the basis of gradual emancipation. And Mr. DeBow, who was the editor of the Southern Quarterly Review, stated that Governor Aiken of South Carolina, the owner of over 1,000 slaves, had spoken to him more than 2 years previously in favor of emancipation to secure recognition, and had urged him to employ his pen to bring the subject before the people of the Confederate States. It was at this time reported that commissioners had gone from the Confederacy to Washington on a peace mission. I spent Wednesday, the 1st of February, with Colonel Baskerville and with Mr. DeBow, who was of the opinion that we should have peace on the 1st of May. The thought of peace almost made me hold my breath, but I feared that the time was not yet. At the same time, the President of the Confederate States appointed a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. Lieutenant Colonel Llewellyn Hoxton, whom I had presented to Bishop Elliott for confirmation at Shelbyville in 1863, spent a night with me. He belonged to an old Virginia family from Alexandria, where he was carefully nurtured in the church, and had instilled into his mind and heart the principles of virtue and religion by the quiet and steady influences of a Christian home. He graduated at West Point in 1861, just at the time of the breaking out of the war. After reaching Washington, he resigned his commission in the United States Army in order that he might go with his State. His resignation was not accepted, but his name was stricken from the roll. He crossed over to Virginia and was ordered by the Secretary of War of the Confederacy to report to General Polk. He was a most faithful soldier, and on many a battlefield displayed conspicuous gallantry. I was unable to get transportation from Columbus before the 7th of February, and before leaving, Bishop Green handed me an envelope containing $200, an offering from a member of St. Paul's Parish. After many annoyances, owing to the crowded state of the trains, I arrived in Meridian. Here I found Captain Frierson of Tennessee. Dr. Foster, the post surgeon, met me at the railway station, and I accepted an invitation to be his guest during his detention at that place. At his quarters I found a number of Nashville friends, General Maney, Captain Alexander Porter, Captain Rice, Major Volks, Captain Kelly, and others. I visited Colonel Hurt, who was commanding Maney's brigade. The brigade was smaller than my old regiment at the beginning of the war. Of all the 1,000 and more who came out in the 1st Tennessee Regiment in May, 1861, I found but 50 men remaining. Many had been killed in battle, others had sickened and died, some were in the house of bondage, and worst of all, some had deserted their colors. I left Meridian on Thursday, the 9th of February, for Demopolis, Alabama, where I arrived at 3 o'clock in the evening. My visit to Demopolis was a pleasant one. While there, the report of the Peace Commission was made public. The failure of the commission was used to rally the spirits of the people, who were told that every avenue to peace was closed, excepting that which might be carved out with the sword. But this attempt to raise the drooping spirits of the South failed. The feeble flare of excitement produced by the fiasco of the Peace Commission was soon totally extinguished. Leaving Demopolis, I accompanied the Rev. Mr. Beckwith to Greensboro, Alabama, to see Bishop Wilmer. During this visit the Bishop held a confirmation service at which I preached, and the offerings, amounting to $530, were given to me for army missions. After the service a gentleman took me to one side and stated that several gentlemen of the congregation desired to present me with a slight token of their regard, and presented me with $700. It took me greatly by surprise. Accompanied by Frank Dunnington, I went to Selma. We put up for the night at a hotel. In the morning I paid for lodging and breakfast $13. I declined the breakfast. The following day I had the great pleasure of meeting my friend, Colonel Harry Yeatman. That morning I visited the Naval Works and spent some time with Captain Ap Catesby Jones. We had much pleasant chat about our Virginia friends. It seemed strange to find a naval establishment in an inland town or upon the banks of a small river, but the truth is, the Confederate government had learned the wisdom of selecting such places for the manufacture of gunboats and naval ordnance in order that they might be the better protected from the raids of the Federals. Captain Catesby Jones had accomplished a vast amount of work at this place. He had some 400 workmen employed, only 90 of whom were white. He had, up to the time I visited him, turned out 190 guns, besides doing a vast amount of other work for the government. He went through the works with me, and showed me the different steps from the melting of the ore to the drilling of the guns. He was casting the Brooks guns almost exclusively, and said that it combined more good points than any other. While in the office at the Naval Works, Mr. Phillips of North Carolina came in to take a look at the works. He was just from Richmond, having traveled with Vice President Alexander H. Stephens as far as Atlanta. He told a story which illustrated Mr. Lincoln's wit, and, as we all thought at that time, lack of dignity, and perhaps also lack of sympathy with those who were interested in the war on the Southern side. Mr. Hunter, one of the commissioners from the South, suggested during a 4 hours interview with Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Seward many instances in history in which governments had treated with insurgents, and mentioned one in the time of Charles I of England. Mr. Lincoln replied, "Seward may know all about the history of that time. All I know is that Charles I lost his head." I reached Montgomery by steamer too late Saturday night for the train to Columbus, Georgia. I was therefore obliged to spend Sunday in Montgomery. My expenses on the steamer, exclusive of fare, were $25, to wit, 3 cups of coffee furnished by one of the servants, $15, and tip to the boys for waiting on me and caring for my traps, $10. With the Reverend Mr. Mitchell, I went that night to a meeting of the citizens of Montgomery, called to consider the condition of affairs then existing. The theater in which the meeting was held was crowded to excess. When we arrived, Governor Watts was addressing the assembled multitude. We could scarcely get standing room. The governor spoke for more than an hour, made many good points, defended President Davis, and altogether his speech was an able one, practical and thoroughly patriotic. He referred to the different spirit displayed by the people at home from that of the soldiers in the field. He was followed by other speakers, and a series of patriotic resolutions was adopted by the people present. I spent Sunday in Montgomery, preached morning and evening, and baptized the son of Lieutenant General Albert J. Smith. Leaving Montgomery the next morning, I arrived at Columbus, Georgia, at 5 o'clock in the evening, after an absence of more than 3 months. I was glad to find my family well. I took up my work of assisting the Reverend Mr. Hawks as before my departure for Tennessee. The 1st of March was Ash Wednesday, and it rained incessantly. I said morning prayer and preached for the rector of the parish, who, though able to attend the service, was looking very badly. His active labors were evidently at an end. 3 weeks later, my former classmate, Dr. Frank Stanford, put him under the influence of chloroform and operated upon him with a knife, removing a cancer. He bore the operation well, and was present to give his blessing, when, on the 5th of April, at the rectory, I united in the bonds of matrimony Captain John S. Smith, aide-de-camp to General Hood, and Sally C. Hawks, the reverend gentleman's daughter; and his health continued reasonably good so long as I remained in Columbus. During the season of Lent I officiated every Sunday for Mr. Hawks, and delivered a course of lectures on confirmation. On the 10th of March, Friday, and the day appointed by President Davis as a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, I preached to a crowded congregation from Isaiah 4:12. I attended to funerals, baptisms, and other parochial duties for Mr. Hawks. Among the baptisms was that of General Warner, Chief Engineer of the Naval Works at Columbus. Another was that of Captain Rodolphe Morode of the 33rd Tennessee, Strahl's Brigade. He was of Swiss parentage, a native of Indiana, and a practicing physician before the war. Major General John C. Brown spent an evening with me just before he left to join his command, having recovered sufficiently from the wound received at the Battle of Franklin. He made a full statement to me of his movements at Spring Hill, which satisfied me that his skirts were clear of even a shadow of blame for the neglect of a great opportunity, as is sometimes said. I had always believed it, for he was at once one of the noblest of men and most accomplished of soldiers. I had united him in the bonds of matrimony with Miss Betty Childress a little more than a year previously at Griffin, Georgia, under somewhat romantic circumstances. Invitations had been issued for the wedding to take place at 9 o'clock in the evening of the 23rd of February, 1864. The groom, accompanied by 9 officers of his staff, arrived in Griffin on the 22nd. But the following morning he received a telegram from General Joseph E. Johnston, ordering him to report at once at Rome, Georgia. The officers who were with him were likewise recalled. General Brown at once sought Miss Childress and laid the case before her. "You will have to return to your command," she said. "But not before you are my wife," he replied. I was in attendance at the hospitals in Griffin at the time, and was sent for and married them at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in the presence of a few friends. The groom said good-bye to his bride and went to the seat of war. 2 weeks later he had a leave of absence, and with his bride took a wedding journey. I baptized the children of this marriage, confirmed all but one, performed the ceremony at the marriage of the eldest daughter, and officiated at her funeral a year later. I was with the heartbroken father at the deathbed of a second daughter, and stood with him at her grave. Thus I knew General Brown in peace and war, in joy and sorrow, in sunshine and beneath the clouds, and I always knew him as a true man, faithful in all the relations of life, broad-minded and generous, an enterprising citizen, a lawyer, a statesman, a man always to be depended upon. He had the good judgment, the force and decision of character, the methodical habit, and the fidelity and integrity of purpose which compelled confidence and made success easy. After I became Bishop of Tennessee, and especially during his term as Governor of Tennessee, we were warm friends. His death on the 17th of August, 1889, was sudden and unexpected. I was apprised thereof by telegram, and hastened to the funeral at Pulaski, Tennessee, where I laid him to rest with the solemn and impressive services of the Church. At another time we had as our guest Lieutenant Colonel Dawson of the 154th Tennessee, and Brigadier General Felix H. Robertson, both nearly recovered from their wounds. But I received the most distressing news of the death of Mr. Jacob K. Sass, President of the Bank of Charleston and Treasurer of the Council of the Church in the Confederate States of America. He had just escaped from Columbia, South Carolina, before its fall, and died at Unionville. He was one of the noblest laymen of the Church, of large heart and mind, full of love for Christ and the Church, abundant in labors, earnest-minded, and pure-hearted. Mr. Rhodes Brown one day handed me a brief and pointed note to the following effect: to the Rev. Dr. Quintard, for his private use, from a few friends. The note contained $2,500, and was no doubt given to enable me to purchase theological books, and I think Mr. Brown was the sole donor. On Palm Sunday, April 9th, I brought before the church people at the services the importance of establishing an orphanage and church home in Columbus, and gave notice that the offerings on the following Sunday, Easter, would be for that purpose. On Good Friday it was with great delight that I received into the church by baptism my old friend, General Washington Barrow of Nashville. He was one of my earliest friends in that city, and always commanded my highest and warmest regard. He had received a classical education, studied law, and was admitted to the bar. He was American charge d'affaires in Portugal from 1841 to 1844, served in Congress as a Whig from Tennessee, was State Senator in 1860 and 1861, and a member of the commission that negotiated a military league between the Southern States on the 4th of May, 1861. He was arrested in March, 1862, by Governor Johnson of Tennessee on charge of disloyalty, and was imprisoned in the penitentiary at Nashville, but was released the following week by order of President Lincoln. He died in St. Louis in October, 1866. Before Easter came, Charleston, the city by the sea, after as gallant a defense as the records of history, ancient or modern, furnish, had fallen. Columbia had suffered severely from a visit of the Federal forces. Selma, Alabama, had been taken and the larger part of it burned. Finally, the rumors that had reached us from time to time that Richmond had fallen were confirmed. General Howell Cobb wrote to the mayor of Columbus, urging him to do all in his power to arouse the citizens to a sense of their duty, to oppose the arming of the negroes, and to promise from the military authorities all the assistance that could be rendered. But from the address of President Davis upon the occasion of the fall of Richmond, and from the proclamation of the Governor of Alabama to the people of his State when it was threatened with an invasion of Federal troops, it was evident that hope was dying out in the hearts of the people, and that the end of the Confederacy was not far off. Easter Eve, the enemy was in Montgomery, and that city was surrendered by the mayor without an effort at defense. Everything in Columbus was in commotion. The tranquillity of the place was not in the least served by the distressing news that was received of the assassination of President Lincoln. Absurd preparations were made for the defense of the city, but it was an insignificant force that could be gathered there. Thus Easter dawned. The first service of the day was at 5:30 in the morning, when I celebrated the Holy Communion. There was a very large attendance at this service. Many men were present. It was most solemn and impressive. All hearts were filled with forebodings of what was to come. The enemy was close at hand. At the second service at 10:30, I said the litany and celebrated the Holy Communion. I did not preach, feeling that it was a time for prayer and supplication only. The offerings, as previously announced, were for the church home and orphanage. They amounted to $33,000. I stood at the altar for a considerable time administering the sacrament to officers and soldiers who came to receive before going to the field. Among these I recognized General Finley of Florida and Lieutenant Green, son of the Bishop of Mississippi. I was deeply touched by seeing an officer who was very devout kneel at the chancel rail, and then hasten away equipped for battle, clasping his wife by the hand as he tore himself from her. At noon, the Federal artillery began firing upon the city. The fight for the defense of Columbus was quite a brisk affair. Major General Howell Cobb was chief in command, his second being Colonel Leon von Zinken, commander of the post. Our whole force was less than 4,000, while that of the Federals amounted to some 12,000 or 15,000 under Major General James H. Wilson. The enemy not only greatly outnumbered our force, but was splendidly equipped. The enemy was twice repulsed, but of course our troops had, before very long, to give way before such superiority of numbers and equipment. About 10:30 o'clock on Monday morning our troops fell back across the river into the city and beat a hasty retreat on the road to Macon, numbers of them passing by my house. I had made but little preparation for the coming of the enemy. I had in my possession the money collected at the offertory at the Sunday morning service. This I wrapped up in a piece of rubber cloth, and a friend put it in the top of a tall pine tree for me. It may be there yet, for aught I know. I had at my house a considerable amount of silverware. This was rapidly gathered up, put in a sack, and lowered into a well. Some battlefield trophies were thrown into another well. About midnight we retired to rest, thinking we might be disturbed at any moment. But it was not until 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning that any of the Federal soldiers put in an appearance. The first man who rode into my front yard was a sergeant of the 10th Missouri Cavalry. He asked if I had seen any Confederates about there, to which I replied, "Not since last night." "Which way were they going?" he next inquired. "Towards Macon." "Can we get something to eat?" "Yes, breakfast will soon be ready. Will you walk in?" He rode off and called a lieutenant, who rode up, hitched his horse in the front yard, taking the precaution to throw the front gates wide open. As he went up the steps of the porch, I asked him his name. He then gave it as Jones, but after breakfast he told me his name was Freeze, which it evidently was. I had with me as a guest Mr. Samuel Noble, a very dear friend, who had arrived from Selma on Sunday morning. He was a Pennsylvanian who had been sent South by the Federal Government to secure cotton and prevent its being destroyed by the Confederates. At Selma he had fallen under the suspicion of the Federals, and after being released by them, was taken up as a spy by our soldiers. He was asked with whom he was acquainted, and gave me as his reference. He was accordingly sent on to Columbus in charge of a lieutenant, who instantly released him upon my recognizing him. He was of great service to me in the emergencies which now arose. Lieutenant Freeze seemed a gentlemanly fellow enough, and gave me the following paper for my protection. I have paid a visit to the house of the Reverend C.T. Quintard, where Samuel Noble of Pennsylvania is a guest, for the protection of his person and property. All soldiers will leave everything unmolested until General Wilson can send out a guard as applied for. This property must remain unmolested. Henry H. Freeze, 1st Lieutenant, Company D, 10th Missouri Cavalry, Volunteer, U.S.A. Armed with this document, Mr. Noble determined to keep out all intruders. Several friends took shelter at my house. Infamous outrages were committed in the presence of ladies at my nearest neighbors, and in his effort to protect us, Mr. Noble was twice put in imminent danger, pistols being placed at his head with threats that he would be shot. So I went to headquarters to secure a guard. A neighbor went with me, and a soldier agreed to protect my premises until my return. I called first on General Winslow, with a note from Mr. Noble addressed to both General Winslow and Captain Hodge, his acting adjutant general. Captain Hodge not only treated me with great courtesy, but accompanied me to the office of the provost marshal. Not finding the latter as I desired, I determined to call upon General Wilson. I wrote out a statement of what had transpired at my neighbor's house, and sent it in to the general with my card. The general himself came to the door, shook hands with me very cordially, and invited me into his room, where he introduced me to General McCook. I asked General McCook to read the statement I had written, and he did so. Then, rising from his seat and pacing the floor, he said with great warmth, "Doctor, if you could identify these men who have committed this outrage, I would hang them in a minute if I could put my hands on them." He immediately gave orders to his adjutant, who in turn gave the necessary orders to the provost marshal. By this means I secured a guard for my own house and for 3 of my neighbors. It was to the great relief of my family that I finally returned home, for they feared from my long absence that some mishap had befallen me. We had a quiet night, and I had the good fortune the next morning to save both of my horses. On leaving the breakfast table, I walked out on the front porch and saw 2 Federal soldiers putting their saddles on my horses. I called to the lieutenant in command of the guard to know if I must give them both up. He came out immediately, buckled on his sword, went to the men, gave them a sound thumping with his sword, and ordered them to unsaddle and give up the horses. They at once obeyed, and I put the horses in the basement of my house. When an hour later 4 other soldiers came dashing up expecting to secure my horses, they failed to find them, and Mr. Noble went out and put the intruders off the premises. A few days later the guards were all called in, the troops having been ordered forward on the road to Macon. A number of stragglers came to the house from time to time and made efforts to enter it, but without success. One night the torch was applied to the government property, factories, etc., in Columbus. The heavens were brilliantly lighted up, and at intervals there were tremendous explosions. The loudest was at 1 o'clock, when the magazine was fired. It shattered the glass in houses 2 miles away. All along the river the enemy left a scene of desolation and ruin. All the bridges were destroyed, the factories, naval works, nitro works, and cotton houses were all burned. The shops in the town were all pillaged, chiefly by the poor of the town. The destruction is said to have involved about $15 millions. End of chapter 13.